Okay, on a completely different level, on the social side of things, we have this iconic story in Brighton about Dr. King, who poisoned his wife. That happened in this period, right at the end of the 1850s. And just briefly, Dr. William Henry King, who grew up at Codrington, started practicing medicine in Brighton in 1856. He practiced what they called homeopathic medicine, a newfangled thing at the time. He had married Sarah Lawson from the Lawson family down at Lawson Settlement, and she was a sister of Monroe and Clinton Lawson, who we met earlier, related to the railway. They lived on Sanford Street near Kingsley, right around, I think, where the Anglican Church parking lot is today. There was a house in there. And of course, in those days, doctors practiced out of their house for the most part. So just think of it. Prosperous community, all this business going on. This handsome young fellow, charming by all accounts, comes in and starts practice of medicine. You can imagine that the matrons of Brighton lined up in his waiting room. However, November 4th, 1858, his wife, Sarah, died. It was determined that she died from arsenic poisoning. Her husband was tried and found guilty, and he was hung at the courthouse in Coburg on July 9th, 1859. Now, I have a picture of the gravestone of William Henry King here. There's a whole interesting story about that, which I won't get into today. I have a board back here with some of the information. But I'd suggest that you might mark it in your calendar. On the Thursday before we have our open house, our history open house in February, we're going to have a presentation where I will be giving the full King story at the time and some other things. We're planning on that. Hopefully we can do it. It's early now, but that is kind of the long-range plan. So mark your calendar. But back to the time, in the 1850s, this would have been a huge story. This would have been a scandal like never before. It would have set tongues wagging all over the countryside. I characterize it as the O.J. Simpson trial of the 1850s. You know, we remember the hullabaloo that went on in the 1990s with O.J. and all that. Well, it would have been the same kind of thing. Now, they didn't have the media and the technology that we have today, of course, but they had media. The newspapers in Toronto, there was half a dozen newspapers in Toronto, there was reporters crawling all over the place for years on this story. During the period between his conviction and his hanging, about 6 weeks, ministers and clerics from all over the place come here trying to get him to confess. Anyway, this would have been a big deal in the community. It's not so much a change in all the practical ways, but you can imagine the ripples of this. It was like a big rock thrown in a pond, and the ripples would have gone out and into the wider community, a lot wider than just Brighton here, but it would have had a major impact on this community. Something else that was of importance, a little more mundane, but at the end of the 1850s, Brighton Village decided that they were going to separate from Brighton Township. Remember, Brighton Township was created just in January 1st, 1852. And you can imagine the discussions that went on at the time. Folks in the village wanted to concentrate on their own issues. Can't imagine how many references you see in the Toby book to sidewalks. It's a big issue. So they decided to separate. We see in the records June 5th, 1858, Brighton Village is incorporated. We see on September 3rd, the council books are divided between Brighton Village and Brighton Township. And then on January 31st, 1859, the first bylaws that were passed by the new council of the village of Brighton. I see this in very tangible terms because I do genealogy. I use the census records all the time. When you look at the 1851 census, it's all one big long list. And if I want to determine whether somebody lived in town or in the village or in the country, I've got to know that from another source. It doesn't say so in the list. But the 1861 census is two completely separate piles of paper. There's the village list and there's the township list. So it's very tangible in a lot of ways. And there, of course, would have been some changes for this. But the one that I want to concentrate on today that was a direct result of this change is this wonderful building that we're sitting in here today. When the village decided they were going to separate from the township, both groups would have had to have elections and have new councils. So Brighton Township had their election, got their council together, and they then needed a place to have council meetings. So they decided that they wanted to have a proper township meeting hall. In the records we see November 5th, 1859, we see a bylaw to purchase property for a township hall. The land registry records show on November 14th the transaction for purchasing this tiny little wedge of property on concession, or lot 3, concession 5, to put the hall on. Now, I've got a segment of the map here, county atlas map. The concession road runs here. There's the village of Hilton. Brighton and Seymour Gravel Road comes up here from the south. See, there's the township right there. It's marked on the map. It's in that nice little wedge, the concession road and the road going. But look at the way the roads are oriented here. Again, this is a map from 1878. It would have been very similar in 1850s when this was done. You can see why Robert Rogers, who owned that lot at the time, would have been quite happy to sell that little wedge of land. It was not much use to him because that little wedge had been created by this road, the way the road went at an angle off the concession road. So I'm sure he would have been happy to sell it. In a sense, it was an ideal spot for a property, for a building like this. One thing I'm interested in, you look to see when you came from the south and came up to the concession road in those days, you didn't go right through like the road does now. You turned right. You went down the concession road, and then you turned on this nice little curve here that we have by the hall. But even then, look what happens. The road doesn't go to the north like it does today. Look where it went. It went off to the northeast out into the fields. And went north from there and meanders back over to the breakaway at some point. So again, I don't know exactly when this changed. It might have been around 1930 when other parts of the road were changed a bit. I'd be interested to find that out if anybody knows. But anyway, that was the way it came about. December 10th, 1859, we see a resolution to contract with Joseph Adams as the mason to build Township Hall. Now, for those folks who recall the breakaway story, you might remember this guy's name. This fellow, back on April 21st, 1852, was a 20-year-old Englishman. He was supposed to be working with Lewis Shearer in his sawmill that night. But he'd made an arrangement with John Harrington, who was a farmer from over in the 3rd concession, to take his place. Because he wanted to go to a card game. So, that was a very unlucky day for John Harrington because he lost his life in the breakaway. Joseph Adams, I assume, went to the card game. I don't know if he won anything, but it was a lucky day for him. So 7 years later, he's made himself into a pretty good stonemason. And the new township council contracts with him to build their new meeting hall. So when you look, at this wonderful stonemasonry out here that's been kept up beautifully by the municipality over the years, that's his work. November 7th, 1860. You see, there's a period there of several months we didn't have any records because they were building the building. November 7th, the end of the year, we have a bill for $14.75 for tables and chairs to furnish the building. So they were going to start having meetings. And then on December 22nd, we see a bill for wood to heat the hall. So now they were using it as their meeting hall. So that's how the Township Hall came about, one of our really excellent heritage buildings and a great place to have history things like this.